we more than the level at which they intervene, because this gives them a wider perspective, the capacity to better understand what's ongoing and to take better decisions.
So one other thing that's important with regard to anticipatory governance and principles of anticipatory governance are the skills needed. And there's some lovely work done by Nesta which mentions these skills, and I think they should be acquired and nurtured in the region. And these are skills like being agile, so the ability to respond to changing environments and conditions, a curiosity, being reflective, sort of having the habit of critically reflecting on process and policy, being willing to take risk. That's a skill. It can be acquired, it can be nurtured. Imaginative, a resilience, of course, is critically important. And then, of course, being empathetic. Understanding others' experiences and frames of reference is going to be critical going forward if you want to be working with anticipatory governance and its systems perspective.
Continuing to work within traditional legacy systems promises to become more and more dysfunctional. That's a problem. That's a problem for decision makers, but that's a problem especially for people. And there will be consequences, I suppose, if traditional dysfunctional legacy systems are maintained in activity.
Good morning and good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, participants, and an especially warm welcome to our speakers and panelists. My name is Noema Grobbelaar and I'm the Research Director at SAIA. It's an honor to welcome you to this webinar on building anticipatory governance in SADC post-COVID-19 that is co-organized by SAIA and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. The work that is presented today is the outcome of a journey that started in 2018 when SAIA, with support from CAS, launched the Regional Observatory Program, now called SAIA's Futures Program. The key drivers for the establishment of this program at that time were the rapid changes, volatility, and uncertainty that we were observing as an institute in both the regional and global context, ranging from the impact of emerging technologies and the fourth IR, the increasing vulnerability of our region to rapid climate change, and a growing disconnect between society and governments. But most significantly for our region, the retreat of multilateralism and a move away from regional collaboration in some quarters, as was so evident in the breakup of the European Union following Brexit. For decades, the European Union was the model that informed the formation of SADC and that guided regional collaboration in Southern Africa and elsewhere in our region. Our sense was that contrary to these developments, the case for regional collaboration and multilateral collaboration has never been stronger than now, given the scale of many of the new and emerging challenges facing the members of SADC and its people. This perspective has been further enforced by the ravages wrought by COVID-19 on our societies, which has also exposed the weaknesses in our governance frameworks. There is a need to work much more closely on these challenges in the region and to develop a vision and collaborative approaches that can draw on the strengths, insights, and capabilities of the whole of society in SADC. Our Futures program seeks to achieve this aim. Before I hand over to Henning Suhr, the CAS regional representative in South Africa, to make his opening remarks, I would like to use this opportunity to thank CAS and Henning specifically for supporting our vision and the continued support of our work. Thank you very much. I wish you a very fruitful webinar. Henning, handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Neuma, and hello to everyone wherever you are on the screens. Also, warm welcome to Dion, who had the head on with this with the study on anticipatory governance. I really would like to thank, first of all, Saya and here Neuma, Dion, and all the rest of the staff for this good cooperation between the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and Saya. As all of you know, Saya is one of the most renowned think tank on the African continent, and CAS has a very broad network all across the world with its offices, and we ourselves, we also produce a lot of papers. So I think that this cooperation is very it's a very genuine thing to do, and there are lots of synergies which we still can explore. Coming to the topic of today, anticipatory governance, I think it is due to the COVID crisis very obvious and very evident that there is a huge need to plan better for the future. And actually, this term anticipatory governance, which we heard already a lot of about it in this great video before, somehow it's self-explaining, because governance always should be anticipatory. I mean, we expect a government to have a police and firefighters. Why? In order to avoid crime and to avoid fire, for instance. That's a very, it might be a very dull example, but actually it's true. But I think it's very, the reason that we talk about anticipatory governance really shows that there is still a lot to do. And if I may mention here a study by the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in 2019 on global health issues. There was an article from an author who was warning for that there will be a certain variety of viruses which could cause a global pandemic. And one of the viruses mentioned was the coronavirus. So unfortunately, this author, he was right by warning from the coronavirus. But with this example, I just would like to point out that actually we could have done better. The world could have done better. And here I also talk about the interconnectedness of the problems all across the world. It's very, very complex. With in a globalized world where we all work together and we travel around and goods are circling the globe, and we have really like global networks and very complex systems, and we are very dependent on each other. So we are all in this together, and therefore we also have to plan together. And often in the political debate, government, they behave like if prevention would be an additional cost, but actually it's the opposite. It's an investment into the future. And so we as a political foundation from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation are very much interested in the question in how we can bring government to achieve a better governance, to have better policies in place, and to do the right things in order to avoid disasters which will occur again. Okay, I think I talked here sufficiently. Once again, thank you very much for Saya, and of course all the panelists who are here with us today. I'm very curious, and I will be quiet now and listen carefully to the debate. Thank you very much. And I think I should hand over to Dion.
Yes, thank you, Henning. Thank you so much. We really welcome everyone to this lovely panel. Thank you, panel and webinar, and thank you for this exciting words you just gave us from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I know that they are always interested in being proactive and forward-looking, and we trying to produce work that do speak to those objectives. So with that being said, I'd like to now start the program formally and take our next steps, introducing some of our people, the panelists and the speakers that we have invited today to start the conversation. I think we had a lovely video in the beginning that just gave you a little bit of a taster of what's to come today, and what will be coming in the future as well. So with this being said, I'd like to now introduce our first speaker, and that is Dr. Piret Soenerust. She is the project manager and lead on systems thinking and anticipatory innovation governance at the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation at the OECD. And I now invite you to start your presentation. Thank you for joining us, Piret, and I'm looking forward to your all your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dion, and thank you for both of the organizers for such a great event. And it's definitely a crucial topic nowadays to actually talk about anticipatory innovation governance, because for us, from the OECD perspective, this really is the next step forward in terms of where governance is actually going and the steps we need to take forward based on that. And we at the OECD and the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation have been working on anticipatory innovation governance. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the approach is and how it also takes a more ambitious steps towards governments and how they use futures thinking and how they use strategic foresight. And I think based on the great discussions and also the great speakers up front and the video that was presented, I don't have to really make a case about why we need a new approach in terms of there are many complex challenges coming forward, from climate change to migration to different issues that the governments need to actually contend with. And we're also facing many hookup problems already today that need a different type of a governance approach. So there's no secret that we are facing, in the process of facing, of different types of uncertainty, different types of unknown effects, from different black swans to black elephants for others, and that can come up unexpectedly and really kind of introducing uncertainty to the policymaking. And one of the key things is to think about, to anticipate, to create the knowledge about those approaches. So introduce more foresight and future thinking in governments. But this is not really going to be enough, because we have great countries that also had great foresight practices and built up those capacities, but they really didn't have an impact into the government action. So how actually government acted based on it. Building on the partnership, early warning systems, infrastructure, taking those elements and actually implementing them in their strategic planning processes in its entirety. So what we find exceptionally important at the OECD is really to think about the future continuously and build up the futures literacy and the capacity to actually kind of imagine different probabilities, both from the kind of risk and dangers to your current system, but also opportunities that you want to pursue. So the opportunities for the future as well, but really to take action today. So not only about the kind of planning for future action, but really acting on these different plausible futures for the future as well. So this is why we really are talking about innovation. So governments do innovation in many different ways. So we innovate, we change things, we update things towards reaching missions, enhancing our systems, adapting to changes on the ground that is upcoming. But we also need to anticipate and innovate based on that. So take action based on that knowledge. So we're dealing with great uncertainty connected to these topics. So we actually have to have a portfolio of actionable different approaches that allow us to explore what would happen or what we would actually like to happen in this context. So having that really as part of the core portfolio of what governments are doing. So at the OECD also, we are seeing governments really going from a reactive position, kind of the wait and see, and let's kind of foresee these dangers and have a risk registry, but really a proactive government. Government as an active shaper. So if we don't want certain risks to emerge, or we see that there are certain elements are beyond our control, what do we need to do today to prepare for those changes, or seize opportunities, or create the preferable future that we want to see in action? So we want to move away from end of the pipe solutions, kind of dealing with crisis shocks once they hit you really hard, but also exploring options and building up capacities to do something about that. And not to say that we can really predict everything. We certainly cannot forecast everything because we're living in an extremely complex world. So the reflexive muscle of innovating, also adapting on the ground, has to be very well developed, even when uncertain futures actually manifest themselves. So we really see the need to actually create the capacity of creating knowledge about the future, but also innovate towards them. And what we see in our governments as well is that you need a governance system that supports that in its entirety. It's not enough to build silos of futures and foresight. It's not enough to set up an innovation lab. You have to actually have a feedback system, a value chain that goes from those types of exercises, paradigmatic changes, these signals, and does something with that information in its entirety. So public organizations also need agency from institutional structures, those capacity, those data, tools and methods, sense-making practices to actually continuously read signals, interpret them, and experiment with alternative uses. But they also need an authorizing environment, something that says that what you're doing is good and legitimate, but also anticipatory innovation practices are evaluated, that there's evidence about their successes, but also in terms of countering vested interests and cognitive biases and networks of incumbent interests that are connected to them. So we need to actually build a governance system that takes that into account so that knowledge can be productively used. And here are some of the work that we have been doing. In our last meeting as well, we have 72 countries around the world of experts who are interested in these approaches. And how to really take this work further, we are seeing a lot of different approaches and scenarios and exploration systems emerging from the European Union to different sustainability scenarios and approaches that take things into practice, to also emerging technologies, having really about the dialogues about how our innovation should be shaping in the future. What it really is to find the key portfolio parts about how governments need to act and integrate those practices inside their practices as well. So we are doing analysis about what those anticipatory innovation governance models look like in practice. How does it interact with funding structures and feedback systems in government? How does it actually develop sense-making practices and capacities within ministries and agencies? What do the learning groups look like? And how also evidence is created in uncertain situations or when we're actually trying to prevent things. So part of the anticipatory innovation portfolio is also connected about things that never happen. So how do you actually feedback and create evidence towards those unhappened events that your system is actually able to prevent? And all of this is needed to actually keep the legitimacy of an anticipatory innovation governance system in place. So we do a lot of work across the different countries around really about the building those insights and the connections between futures and foresight practices, but also standard core practices of government, from strategic planning to fiscal planning and so forth, so they become actionable decisions today. Because we have to have a continuous futures literacy in place because we are living in an extremely uncertain world. So we can actually have action also when the returns of investment is less clear, when we're talking about anticipation and adaptive innovation in its entirety. And last but not least as well is that we really want to also stress is tangible and measurable actions that come out from that systems, from identifying and perceiving new problems, from reframing and problem solving, also accelerating different types of change that the anticipatory innovation governance system actually supposes to allow. So really, to work on this, you have to have a portfolio of actions across these different types of innovations, and also anticipatory innovation create new missions and new options and opportunities for governments to innovate across their different portfolios. And we are trying to look at what those validated elements across the system look like, from citizen participation to policy cycles, political role, and continuity of reforms. So there's a lot of work ahead to actually develop that model, and it's great to see that in your region as well, interest and actually the work on this is ongoing, and we'll have more evidence in taking this work forward as well. Thank you so much.
Dion, we can't hear you. I don't know if you're having a problem with your microphone. May I suggest then that we move to the next session while we try and sort out that problem? Okay. As I'm not hearing anything from Dion, I'm going to, sorry to intervene. May I please then ask that we proceed to the next session. Correct, we'd like to come back to you. Thank you very much for those remarks and for the very broad overview that you've given of the approach from the OECD's perspective. I'm sure we have some questions for you, but we'll come back to you a little bit later. I want to then suggest that we ask Professor Antoni van Niekerk, who's based at the Wits School of Governance, where he's currently coordinating peace and security studies, to do his presentation. And his presentation is focusing on building anticipatory governance in SADC, a post-COVID-19 conflict and defense outlook. Antoni, over to you, please.
Okay, Noema, thank you very much. Is the sound and the video good?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. Let me proceed. Thank you for the invitation. I wanted to see Dion's face when I say the next thing, which is he commissioned me to write this paper on anticipatory governance looking at SADC. There's Dion. Now I can look at you.
Sorry about my microphone was giving issues. I'm so sorry, people. Sorry, Pirate. I missed out there.
And so Dion asked me to write a paper on the defense and security aspects of anticipatory governance in the SADC setting. And you know, colleagues, it was the most difficult paper I had to write apart from my PhD. And I think the reason for that is that I had to learn a new language. It is the language that Pirey has just used in her previous presentation. Conceptually and theoretically slightly different and innovative. And when we talk about futures, we have to understand that language. So what I present now is a much reduced version of the original paper, which I'm assuming Noema, or the organizers, will distribute at some point, because I'm not covering everything in the paper. I was asked to present in 10 minutes. I was hoping for more time. You know, academics talk a lot.
Absolutely. All the papers are available on our website, and we will provide the links, but we're looking forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, colleagues. And by the way, it's nice to see old friends and making new ones. And I'm going to ask Kabele, who's got AU experience, to be gentle with me when he discusses my paper. So on SADC, Over the past 4 decades, it has been able to advance regional cooperation and coordination and eventual integration on many levels, and is a prominent fixture on the Southern African landscape. Yet, it seems unable to galvanize the region to adopt a collective approach to the multitude of threats it faces. So this report and my presentation examines the state of the region's defense and security sectors and considers the conditions under which SADC can adopt the logic of anticipatory governance and the identification of complex priorities to give meaning to the preferable future of a stable and prosperous region. Anticipatory governance is explicitly addressed in national security policy analyses, and it is envisioned here as governance that can manage crises ex ante before the event to prevent their destabilizing effects. This perspective that I'm using focuses on the adaptive capacity of national planning systems, hopefully extending into regional planning. In short, anticipatory governance in this sense is about navigating uncertainty. Let me turn to SADC. I think many of us, but I don't know if all of us, know the vision of SADC. It's a question I always ask my students, then nobody can answer. What is the vision of SADC? It is one of a common future within a regional community where the people of Southern Africa enjoy economic well-being, improved standards of living, freedom and social justice, and peace and security. And indeed, SADC has much to show, but also faces a number of challenges and shortcomings. On the one side, I would argue that it has achieved politically. For example, it worked towards the emancipation of Namibia and South Africa, and post-94 revised its institutional and operational architectures. It expanded its membership from the 9 founding members to 16 today, which includes Comoros. It coordinates its activities very closely with ICPs or donors. Its affairs are run by a very small secretariat in Gaborone. Its member states are committed to processes of policy coordination and political cooperation. Elections are a regular occurrence throughout SADC. It brags about several stable democracies, but at the same time, one can also argue that democracy is under threat in at least 4, if not more, of the member states. I argue in the paper that the biggest challenge to SADC relates to the structure of the African economy. The typical African economy is characterized by a small and well-resourced formal sector that operates in isolation from a large, growing, and poverty-stricken informal economy and communal subsistence economy. Many SADC member states share this profile. In fact, let me turn to the risk landscape in slightly more details. In the paper, I argue that several major global trends impact Southern Africa. The socioeconomic and public health consequences of the COVID pandemic is the most important immediate threat to African nations, including all of Southern Africa. And I also make the argument that the history of SADC's management of peace and security, even under the new regional indicative strategic development plan of 2020 to 2030, fresh out of the box. The history and the experience is one of guarded sovereignty, protecting the interests of ruling elites, and excessively bureaucratic decision-making. Can anticipatory governance therefore be introduced to improve peace and security strategic planning, adaptive capacities, and preparedness? I think that is the key question. In my analysis, it is apparent that the size and preparedness of the SADC defense and security sectors are uneven. On the one hand, 2 member states maintain sizable defense forces and budgets, which is Angola and South Africa. The DRC has a large defense force on paper, but it's unable to restore or maintain law and order or peace. I might be corrected in this seminar. On the other hand, those are the big ones. On the other hand, several member states have minuscule defense and security sectors and budgets. Think of Lesotho or Eswatini or Comoros or the Seychelles. Many of these rely on bilateral arrangements with foreign partners for protection. Except for South Africa, no member state has a defense industry, and indeed in South Africa itself, this industry is on the wane, or on the ropes if you want. Equipment is increasingly obsolete, outdated, or poorly maintained. Few have the ability to participate meaningfully in UN or AU peacekeeping operations. And it is doubtful, I say provocatively, that this collective would be able to mount a SADC standby force or a SADC brigade operation to deal with a breach of peace and security or a substantial natural disaster. International cooperation is therefore unavoidable. Given this, how can national security decision makers build or engage with broad-based capacities in the state and non-state sectors to think about and prepare for the future? Let me come to the second half of my presentation before I conclude by using a case study, a mini case study, to show what is possible. I want to look at Cabo Delgado. So as the insurgency unfolds in northern Mozambique, where foreign firms have started and seemingly abandoned gas extraction operations, civil society has been mapping out scenarios in the hope of influencing SADC's strategic policy choices. It has yet to make a decision, SADC that is, in terms of an intervention or not. These scenarios offer plausible futures and suggest steps to counter negative trends and dynamics. And let me offer very briefly three outlines of 3 such scenarios. The first one is an emboldened Al-Sunna wa Jamaa, which is the name of the insurgents or the violent extremists in the northern part of Mozambique, bordering Tanzania with Comoros just across the waters. An emboldened Al-Sunna is the scenario that is most attuned to the present reality. What does this entail? Militants increase recruitment, acquire more resources, recover and learn from offenses, and continue to capitalize on government's one-sided narrative and alienation from the local population to win the hearts and minds of youthful recruits. The overly securitized response by government is mostly counterproductive. The humanitarian situation deteriorates further. The second scenario is jihadist contagion effect with ISIS backing. This is the worst case scenario in which the Central African province of ISIS, ISCAP, considers itself the owner of violence, building on an alliance of convenience between ISIS, illicit business, and local armed jihadist groups to create an Islamist proto-state in Cabo Delgado to prevent newcomer elites and private interests from profiteering out of the Cabo Delgado liquefied natural gas industry. The secessionist elements in Mozambique reawaken historical political rifts and ethnic cleavages, leading to further destabilization and violence. And then the third one, Al-Sunna wa Jamaa contained. In this best case scenario, Al-Sunna overextends itself militarily, undermining its local support, and the government manages to contain the threat within Cabo Delgado. All 3 scenarios must be weighed against the potential pitfalls of the so-called Iraqification of the insurgency in Cabo Delgado linked to foreign interests, or the internationalization of the local conflict, if you want. Many argue it's busy happening. The anticipatory governance approach would elaborate the scenarios as strategy and design tools to enable actors to make decisions that could lead to the outcomes described in scenario 3, the one that we want to happen. From this perspective, the Mozambican government and SADC would be able to take a number of proactive steps which are described in the paper, including deepening of democracy and good governance, embracing a whole of government approach aimed at addressing root causes at community level, boosting intelligence gathering and information sharing with regional security counterparts, working with international partners and local NGOs to arrest or address the growing humanitarian catastrophe. By year end, perhaps 1 million people being displaced in our region. And then SADC purposefully strengthening its research and analysis capacity by creating a countering and preventing violent extremism unit rather than a counter-terrorism unit. So, to conclude, what could the way be forward? In our analysis in the paper, we suggest that the entire region needs to undertake a deep security sector review. Such an exercise must enjoy popular support among the region's key stakeholders, namely governments, citizens, and donors. There is no need to engage an international consultancy or import a ready-made template from the EU or the US. The spade work has been done by the AU, and Gabele will remind us that there's a policy framework on security sector reform in place. And in this policy, allow me to say, security sector reform refers to processes by which countries formulate or reorient policy structures and capacities of institutions and groups engaged in the security sector, broadly defined, in order to make them more effective, efficient, and responsive to democratic control and to the security and justice needs of the people. A reformatted security sector is key to the logic of an integrated regional indicative strategic development plan. Peace and security and democracy and development are mutually constitutive. The one strategic set of goals cannot be achieved without the other. And so we propose that the SADC Secretariat ought to establish a regional task force of experts from state and non-state sectors, supported by a coalition of willing donors to design and oversee the implementation of such a process. The design must build on SADC's commitments to democracy, development, and good governance, be sensitive to local conditions, and at the same time promote collective, mutually supportive decision-making in order to forge deeper regional relations of trust and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. We appreciate your insights and work on this paper. I know it was a road and a journey that was not traveled before, but I think it's anticipatory governance is new in many parts of the world, and it's explorative and experimentative approach to doing things deeply and newly and really in depth in government and governance in general. So I'd like to now just invite the respondent to this paper, Dr. Gabele Matlosa from the Department of Political and Administrative Studies at the department at the National University of Lesotho to just engage with this paper in dialogue. We are running a little bit late, and but I'd really appreciate your views as well. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dion. And I would like to thank Tony for this interesting paper. I was brought into the initiative rather late. Only a couple of days ago, I was approached by my colleague and friend Dimpo, who was supposed to play this role, but apparently she has a clash of schedules. So I'm just standing in for her. And I'm going to, since I also received the paper a couple of days ago, so I've gone through it. So I'm going to raise just a few issues, but it's a very interesting paper, I must admit, and commend Tony for this work. And I was fascinated by the concept of anticipatory governance. I must admit, it's the first time I come across this concept, and it's quite interesting. And I enjoyed the way it is being used in the paper. And Tony defines it clearly on page 7. And then on page 16, he provides the key components of the concept to make it clear to the reader. So I think it's an interesting entry to the discussion. Now, let me just raise 5 key points. Some of them are just proposals. Others, I think we can discuss and debate. The first is on page 10. I think from page 10 onwards, Tony spends some pages there discussing global mega trends on page 10, and which is quite fascinating also. But I wanted to just make a proposal that, for example, on pages 11 and 12, where he discusses technological instabilities as a global mega trend that also has its own risks to peace and security landscape in Southern Africa. I wanted to propose that he could enrich that section, that discussion, by fusing into his own ideas on technological instabilities. I think he also deals with social media, negative effects of social media by way of fake news and deep fakes. I wanted to suggest that maybe it would be also quite interesting if we weave in that part of discussion, we weave in issues around the 4th industrial revolution and artificial intelligence as part of technological instabilities that could come about and disrupting the peace and security landscape in Southern Africa. So if we could just bring that, for example, the issue of drones. The drones now being used in conflict zones, that I think in a way gives us a glimpse of the possible negative ramifications of the 4th industrial revolution and artificial intelligence. So I think it would be interesting if Tony could build within that aspect in that aspect of the discussions. That's number 1. Number 2, and I said I'm going to raise only 5. Number 2 relates to the discussion on the public health pandemics. I think there's a point he makes on page 13. Around SADC being unable to deal with the health epidemics. I think he refers to Ebola and also currently the COVID-19. I wanted to make a point there, and just to reinforce his argument on that aspect of the paper. That part of the problem, and I think it comes out in other aspects of the paper. Part of the problem that SADC is faced with, and this is not only the problem of SADC, by the way. I've been with the African Union. I'm not with the National University of Lesotho, actually. I've just left the African Union. So I was with the African Union as the director for Department of Political Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, not National University of Lesotho. Just a correction. The point I wanted to make, and this applies to the whole continent, actually. African Union, SADC, you can talk of other RACs, ECOWAS, ESC, you name them. Here is the problem. The way these regional organizations they conduct their business is that they are state-centric. everything is around states. Even when they perceive of security, it is state security. So even when they try to respond to these pandemics, it is state security lens of response. So for them, the priority is given to state security. That is a problem. So the problem is actually even the approach, the very approach itself. Look at how they approached the pandemic, the COVID-19. They deployed the militaries, they deployed the security forces in the streets. So you see, so there's less investment or less emphasis on human security as against state security. So I wanted just to reinforce that point because Tony makes it just to make it clearer. Now, my
Kabele, sorry to interrupt. Yes, if you can just be quite succinct in your points, your 5 points, so that we can get Anthony to respond. We unfortunately don't have all of the time to go into depth of the pages of the report, but let's just try and focus on the higher order questions you'd like to ask him or address. Thank you very much.
The third point is the issue around the extent to which SADC itself can actually adopt anticipatory governance as an approach. And I would like to offer 3 bottlenecks that may constrain SADC in doing that. One is that the SADC is still imbued with the doctrine of non-interference in the internal affairs of its member states, which is an old doctrine of the African Union. African Union has long moved away from that. The OAU was the one adopting the non-interference. Now, the African Union presently emphasizes the doctrine of non-indifference to human rights abuses. So I think SADC better, start adopting that new norm. The second bottleneck is that the issue of sovereignty. The issue of sovereignty is another bottleneck. That sovereignty, reigns supreme over and above regional initiatives towards peace and security. So sovereignty is actually a shield towards SADC, assisting its member states. The last one, which Tony may want to address actually, is the lack in Southern Africa, unlike in West Africa, the lack of a clear-cut regional leader or regional hegemon that would also take responsibility, even when others are reluctant. In ECOWAS, we know that Nigeria is able to play that role very well. South Africa was supposed to play that, but we know for historical reasons that is not the case. So Tony may want to address that. But maybe let me land on one last issue. This one, Tony also may want to address it. It's rather controversial. Not controversial, but I'm raising a substantive issue regarding the case study of the crisis in Mozambique, northern province of Cabo Delgado. There are 2 schools of thought of how to understand that crisis, and that would also inform how to propose solutions and scenarios going forward. One school is that is the one that perceives of the crisis as being brought about by terrorism and violent extremism, and therefore externally prepared. So I see Tony leaning in that direction. I want him to probably deal with this. But there's another school that sees the problem as internal within Mozambique, as related to structural, deficiencies of the Mozambican political economy. In that you have a situation where in a province like that has a lot of natural resources, but people, a large number of people are marginalized, they are poor, and they don't enjoy the benefits of the natural resources that accrue from the province. This only benefits a small category of elites that then partner with international companies in exploiting this natural resource at the expense of the majority of the citizens. Then this brings about disgruntlement or a grievance, basically. Therefore, the terrorists exploit that. Then in resolving this, do we focus on terrorism or do we focus on structural deficiencies of the political economy in terms of unemployment, hunger, inequality, poverty, etc.? So it's a matter of the entry point And that entry point will then tell us how do we propose solutions. Do we propose solutions only confined to addressing terrorism, al-Sunnah, Wajama, or combining the solution in terms of dealing with terrorism, at the same time, enhancing the socioeconomic well-being and livelihoods of the people in Cabo Delgado. That would be my comment, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Madlosa. We appreciate your insightful comments on the paper, and we value your views. Anthony, would you like to respond? And then we also have some other questions that came up in the Q&A already that I can also add to those, but let's see how far we can get in our response. Thank you.
Yeah, so Dion, thank you, Khabele. I appreciate your wisdom and insight. I can keep my responses fairly short by saying that I take some of these as comments. And I want to propose, Dion, in the spirit of innovation and anticipatory governance, that some of the stuff that comes out of this webinar needs to be factored into our papers. Papers are passive. They've been written 3 months ago. They sit there. We want something more dynamic, and there must be a way to display our knowledge in a better way. So, for example, I fully agree the latest iterations of 4IR and artificial intelligence, the use of drones, etc., increasingly sophisticated. Somebody said another worst case scenario is a terrorist organization employ drones as attack vehicles in our part of the world. These are fast-moving developments that needs to be placed somewhere in our body of knowledge as we try and explain to decision makers that they have to adopt a new way of thinking. So that's my first point. The second one, quickly on Cabo Delgado, I agree with Khabele when he says that on the basis of local grievances relating to a governance dysfunction or an ungoverned space and the political economy of Cabo Delgado, on the basis of this local grievance, others have come in and exploited the situation. They have now called themselves a name, Al-Sunnah, and they are partnering at a very fast pace. Again, it's something that our anticipatory governance mode of knowledge transfer needs to be attentive to. As I speak, partners are being sucked into, or outside interests are being sucked into an emerging crisis in a part of SADC, uncontrolled, some by design and some by self-invitation. It is indeed a troublesome feature. The third thing, Dion, let me say that I think the biggest challenge for us as thinkers around anticipatory governance is this. How do you sell this approach to decision makers when they are state-driven, state-centric, guard their sovereignty with jealousy, which means outsiders cannot decide for what happens inside a government or a country, prefer non-interference for political reasons, take decisions that protect ruling elites, and then finally, an intriguing thought, it's maybe a conundrum that we have to battle with, do we lack a regional hegemon or a regional leader? And that is the question. I wonder how many South African excellencies in the audience who can answer this question. What is the role of South Africa in Southern Africa? What kind of leadership does South Africa provide to SADC? In August, a few months from now, South Africa will take over the chair of the SADC organ on politics, defense, and security cooperation. I have asked our diplomats, and maybe you have done so too, Dion, what is our plan? Apart from that old tired Durko refrain of the African agenda, etc., etc. And so for me, that is the deepest problem, is how do we capacitate smart decision makers who sit in positions to influence the future of the region? And are they in SADC, or can we deploy them to SADC, or can SADC become a learning organization in the spirit of this conversation? Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Yes, and just to add, we had a question on basically not only if SADC cannot provide the military capacity, then what's the role of the AU in this and discussion? Just in maybe a quick response on that, because it was mentioned.
So yeah, very brief. The African peace and security architecture and the culture of decision making at the level of the AU is that regions, what we call regional economic communities, or RECs, which is an unfortunate acronym, must take care of their problems at home first. And if they are unable to do so, or if they require assistance, they can then resort to the mother body, as it's sometimes called, the AU, assuming that there's a healthy relationship between the AU, the continental organization, and the regional bodies. And even if this doesn't work, we can then resort to assistance from the United Nations organization, which has an arsenal of tools in its toolbox to help assist. So the conundrum now is whether the Mozambican government is prepared to accept an offer of assistance from SADC, whether that offer is the appropriate policy and operational response to a crisis in the region, whether it needs external partners in the form of African-owned solutions, or whether it's okay for the government of Mozambique to make a deal with Portugal, the EU, the Americans, the Russian, and private military companies, of which you find in South Africa, as an effort to contain what SADC now calls terrorism. And I must agree with Gabele, that is the wrong definition of the problem. The problem is not terrorism. The problem is much deeper than that.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. We appreciate your paper, the work that went into it, and Dr. Matlosi's contribution to it. We now have to move on to the next presentation and topic of the day on disaster risk reduction. And we hope to still hear from you and contribute to you in the future to the paper and the work being done in the space of conflict and defense. Thank you very much. I will now introduce our next speaker, and that will be Professor Fritz Nganye, is an associate professor of international relations at the Department of Politics and International Relations, University of Johannesburg, and he will present his work on building anticipatory governance in SADC with a specific focus on governance. Thank you very much. And then we'll have a respondent to this paper in the form of Dr. Lucy Shule, who is the Director of Studies at the National Defense College of Tanzania, as well as another respondent of Donna DuPont, and we'll introduce her a little bit later. Let's hear first from Professor Fritz Nganye. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dion and colleagues. I hope you're able to hear me.
Yes, thank you.
I understand Anthony had 10 minutes. I understand I only have 6 minutes to do my presentation. So I'll try to be as brief as possible to just highlight the key aspects of my paper. So as Dion has indicated, I was requested to look at the post-COVID-19 governance outlook in the region, and of course, the possibilities of an anticipatory governance framework in the SADC region. So in the paper, I depart from the premise that COVID-19 pandemic is emblematic of the contemporary challenges that we are confronted with as a world today. I think a lot has been said already about the nature of these challenges, as well as the anticipatory governance framework. So in the interest of time, I will not go into those. I should just indicate that what I set out to do in the paper is to actually use the COVID-19 pandemic as an entry point to explore what are the governance implications of uncertainty and accelerated change in the context of the SADC region. And I make two key arguments in the paper, which I'm going to briefly summarize here. The first argument is that the existing governance systems in the SADC region generally fall short of the adaptive capacity that is required to navigate complexity and the volatile problems that are symbolized by the COVID-19 pandemic. But more importantly, I argue in the paper that if we have to adopt an effective anticipatory governance framework in the SADC region, then that has to be underpinned by corresponding effort to be able to reimagine and reconstruct the societies in this region, because as I'm going to point out shortly, that we are talking here about societies that are troubled and deeply polarized, and that in order for us to be able to make good use of the anticipatory governance framework, then we need to equally put in place processes to try to bring, to build these societies, so that whatever governance approach that is put forward should be underpinned by societies that are held together and with some significant level of social cohesion and understanding among the different stakeholders in the SADC region. So as I said, in the interest of time, I'm not going into the conceptual framework of the paper, but I'll rather talk about what I try to do in looking at the different challenges that the region is confronted with, as well as the nature of the governance capacity that have been deployed to deal with the challenges in the region. And the SADC region, like the rest of the world, as I point out in the paper, is confronted with what I refer to as a perfect storm of wicked problems. Some of these have already been highlighted by previous speakers, where we have issues of political instability and violent conflict, as well as insurgencies. But we also have the challenge of youth unemployment, which is more or less a ticking time bomb in the region. Importantly, there's the problem of growing poverty and inequality, where the wealth of the region remains in the hands of a few, while the large part of the population languishes in poverty. And this, of course, has given rise to social tensions that continue to boil, and we see them come to the surface now and then in different countries in the region. In the paper, I also point out the threat that is inherent in the growing public debt that we find in most countries in the region, that may become a significant governance challenge, and that may equally pose to be a source of instability in the region. Of course, we've got the problems that are associated with climate change. We saw what happened in Mozambique in the form of the cyclones, and the region is also periodically affected by drought. So all these constitute a great threat to the stability of the region. But I do argue in the paper that even as this perfect storm threatens the region, the governance capacity to be able to navigate and manage the consequences of these problems has gradually been declining. If you look across the region, in most of the countries in the region, there is very little to write about in terms of the effectiveness of the governance system to deal with the challenges that arise in these societies. And in trying to make sense of the declining governance capacity in the region, I identify certain trends and the drivers that actually drive these trends. The first of which is what I consider to be a weak state-society relations in the region. We see a situation where governments are, for the most part, alienated from the broader society, and that makes it difficult for certain government processes to be carried out effectively if they do not have the support and the buy-in of the broader society. But we also have the problem of state fragility, where the functional capacity of key state institutions in many countries in the region has been eroded over time, to the extent that governments have been unable to actually provide the key services that we would expect of a modern democratic state. Of course, there is the problem of corruption and how it is actually launching an assault on accountability and transparency in terms of governance processes in the region. In the paper, I also touch on the problem of democratic accountability and oversight that has been weakened by what I consider to be hegemonic ruling parties. Here we're talking about liberation movements that have been turned into governing parties that have failed to adopt the mindset that is required in a modern and democratic system. So instead of driving the process of social change, we see that most of these ruling parties have become obstacles to accountability and effective democratic oversight. Then there is equally the problem of electoral politics that is gradually degenerating in the region, which has failed to actually deliver on the promises of democratic accountability that should underpin effective governance system. So elections, for the most part, do not really serve much to inspire confidence in the electorate and drive the process of democratic governance. And they also make the case that if at the level of individual SADC countries, we have all these challenges, at the regional level, as Anthony and I think even Kabera Matlose has pointed out, that SADC as a supranational organization that should be able to strengthen the individual governance capacities in the countries in the region has failed to actually play that role. So in terms of governance at the regional level, we see that there is significant weakness, and which means that the ability of the region to pull together and enhance the capacity of the different states has actually not been coming forth. But I also do highlight that despite this grim picture that one can paint, I think there are forces of hope that could be highlighted in the region in the form of the role that civil society or the courts play in trying to push back some of the negative forces or trends that undermine effective governance in the region. Although I must point out that even the role of civil society, the private sector, or even the judiciary, that also needs to be problematized if we have to strengthen the governance capacity of, in the countries in the region. So let me try to conclude by looking at how, in the context of the prevailing governance trends in the region, what or how can an anticipatory governance framework actually be deployed to ensure that the challenges that the region is confronted with are able to be navigated effectively. Now, if we understand anticipatory governance as the need to develop the capacities for forecasting and visioning, as well as to be able to adopt processes of collaboration and participation, then there has to be some preconditions that must be met in a region like Southern Africa if there has to be an effective anticipatory governance framework. And the first of these preconditions that I identify in the paper is the need for a healthy state-society relations, which should also be underpinned by social cohesion. Because we cannot deny the fact that most of the societies in Southern Africa are really fractured societies that are not at peace with themselves. So you cannot talk of being able to visualize alternative futures if the societies that are supposed to be the foundation for such forecasting are not at peace with themselves. So in the paper, I make the recommendation that there may be a need for inclusive social dialogues in most SADC countries, so that some of the key vexing questions that have undermined social cohesion could be dealt with decisively. But importantly, I also argue that there is also a need for there to be transformation in the political economy of most SADC countries to ensure that the situation we currently have, where the wealth of these societies are enjoyed by a small minority to the exclusion of the majority of the population, will not continue to undermine the need for social cohesion and healthy state-society relations. And also make the point that the need to redistribute wealth in the region is important if corruption has to be dealt with decisively. Because if you do not deal with corruption, if you do not deal with the question of socioeconomic justice, then the debates around corruption and confronting corruption will have to be eclipsed by the voices that also make the case for socioeconomic justice in the region. I think John wants to stop me.
No,
so I will
continue. Just if you can start, let's putting forward to the closure. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just highlight one of the other key recommendations I make in the paper, which is the need to strengthen SADC as a supranational institution, because with a strong governance capacity at the regional level, some of the challenges of governance that we have at the national, subnational, and even at the local level could be strengthened by the support that comes from the regional level. And for this to happen, as I think Anthony has already made the argument, that we need regional champions. And that means that countries like South Africa that may have the capacity to lead the process of developing common norms and institutions need to play that leadership role to ensure that SADC develops a regional governance capacity that should be able to strengthen governance at the supranational, at the subnational, and even at the local level. But I also make a key argument that even as civil society, the judiciary and the private sector have been playing a key role to enhance the governance capacity in the region. Their role is not without problem. So these different stakeholders also need to engage in a process of self-reflection to rethink how they engage in the different activities in the region to ensure that they support the process of developing the governance capacity of the region rather than undermine effective governance. I think it is in this broader framework that we can start thinking of an anticipatory governance framework in the SADC region. I think I will stop here and then I will engage with the debate further.
Thank you so much. Very insightful, and thank you, Fritz, for your hard work on this paper. We also now invite the respondents to this paper, Dr. Lucy Shule, the Director of Studies at the National Defense College in Tanzania, as well as Donna DuPont, who is the founder and chief strategist in Foresight and Design at Purple Compass. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dion. I'm hearing some of the comments. I'm not sure from my end. Maybe perhaps Dr.
Donna, there seems to be a problem with Lucy's microphone. I wonder whether you want to proceed in the meantime,
Okay.
And let's see if we can sort it. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. So thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to review this paper. I really enjoyed looking at this paper at different stages of its development, and I'm really excited today that Fritz was able to present it. There's a lot of rich information in the paper, and I think he did a great job trying to condense it in the short time that he had. I think for me, looking at the paper and reflecting on what's happening now in the broader context with COVID-19, the pandemic, I think a lot about, when I think about governance and I think about anticipatory governance, and specifically, you know, within government structures and where we are today, there's this tension between the legacy systems and that are really quite rigid and are having a hard time adapting to the changing environment, and a lot of discussion that's taking place, you know, around the world around diversity, inclusiveness, bottom-up approach, you know, really participatory in its engagement in some of the big issues of today. And so it's really, I think, interesting because this type of governance structure that a lot of governments operate on is very paternalistic. It's very top down. It's a legacy system based on, it comes from a variety of different historical references, but certainly it's not inclusive the way it could be. It's not participatory in terms of a whole of society approach. So what we're really talking about at a fundamental level is a shift in just from top down to bottom up governance. And so what does that look like as a structure? And then to support that, there's a big cultural shift that's happening too, right? Like the understanding of it's not about writing policy and commanding into action, and that only a narrow few have that opportunity to make those decisions. But it's really about empowering a broader community and really tapping into that collective intelligence in a very participatory way to really help shape the direction for the future. So I think that's an important piece that we're really bumping up against, is that cultural shift, and that there's a lot of, there's a lot of actions being taken to hold on to the existing identity and fear of change. So I think that is an important element to recognize. And I think with that cultural shift, there's also this perspective of how you see the world. And I think a lot of times in government, myself, I worked in public policy for 12 years, and I did policy at the cabinet level all the way down to strategy and then operations. And sometimes when you are looking at things from a policy lens or a very narrow lens, you're looking at it more in a reactive mode, maybe even more tactical in terms of a government response to an issue of the day. And so I think there's such an important role here for anticipatory governance to help build these layered perspectives, right, of change. So going from perhaps, a traditional planning paradigm to how do you take more of a systemic approach and understand the current state, deep vulnerabilities and inequalities that are happening. And then how do you take that to more of the short-term future of things that we know that are just over the horizon that we have to address, and start to work with, Foresight futures methodologies to do that. And then pushing the horizon towards, transformation and reconceptualizing potential going into the future. So I think there's different stages and lenses that we can take when we're looking at anticipatory futures. And a lot of times you have to meet people where they are. If they're in a very strong planning paradigm, in a very threat-based, very risk mindset, it's almost like you have to build that next layer of understanding the system and understanding futures, and that it has to be a layered approach, because if you just jump to transformation, it might be very hard, because today most governments are just overwhelmed with all of the different issues that they're facing on a day-to-day basis, and it becomes it can be challenging to even contemplate, a transformed future when there are so many issues and they're dealing more in issues management mode. So I think, going forward, I think there's this opportunity to do that. And I would very much would love to open up, the conversation to others and what their thoughts around that and how to build and take people on that journey of building their anticipatory lens and strengthening it in different ways to provide different outputs over a variety of different time horizons based on, the issues and the urgent priorities of any government for the day.
Thank you very much, Donna. Let's hear if we can have participation in this discussion from Lucy. Mm-hmm. Lucy, are you there, and have you sorted your mic?
Oh, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I hope I can be heard now.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I should take this opportunity to thank the organizers for extending the invitation to me to participate in this session. And I'd wish to comment on the presentation and the paper which was done by Professor Nganje on building anticipatory governance in SADC post-COVID-19 governance outlook. This has been an interesting paper and topic as well, and I believe it is one of important, it has made an important contribution, not only in governance, but also in the other dimensions. So I went through the paper and I would like to make some few observations, especially on part 5 of the paper, which is about building anticipatory governance and the issues that have been taken into consideration. One of the areas that the author has raised is about the increasing the online platforms, but perhaps he could have considered maybe the fact that in most of the, I would say, majority of the African or SADC countries, societies, perhaps may not have access to those platforms which would need internet connections, and maybe the solution could have been probably to ensure that they get access to internet so that they can have an increasing participation on the online platforms. And the same applies to the same comment will go also to the exploring the possibility of electronic voting system, as we have seen that it has turned out to be a challenge to the other African countries which have attempted to do so, because as the experience shows, somewhere in the middle of elections, then you can hear that the majority of the voters could not vote because of the
Lucy, can you just try and speak up, please? Thank you.
Yes, please. And the other comment is on the building a sizable, professional and skilled and ethical public service platform. In my comment, I wish to comment that perhaps the writer could have looked into how the education system is structured, because by academic institutions, it might be, I'm not sure, I couldn't have an opportunity to ask him, what does it refer to when we talk about academic institutions? But for me, the education system as a whole will have more input into building anticipatory governance rather than having maybe higher learning institution and research institution alone. But maybe another point which the author could have considered is about empowering the people, because he brought out the point about state-society relations and strengthening civil society organizations and judiciary. Well, I think the people are also important in order to have all-inclusive process that will build for the future. And my final comment is on the whole taking on board the historical aspects that inform the way the SADC region has been created, because that has a defining parameter of what is happening in terms of the governance structures and what he has pointed out as challenges in the SADC region. Thank you very much.
Dion, are you having a problem with your mic? Noima?
Sorry, I am very sorry. We seem to be having a couple of technical problems this afternoon. Fritz, I wonder, can I ask you, would you like to respond to Donna and Lucy's comments very briefly for us, please?
Yes, thank you, Numa. I think I do agree with Donna that the key point here is how to ensure that we take the people along in how we visualize the governance system that we want to use to deal with the contemporary challenges. And I think that's why I made the argument in the paper that in addition to ensuring that state-society relations restored and made stronger, that there is need for a new kind of politics, one of accountability, transparency, and openness, so that when representatives are elected, after the elections, they don't insulate themselves from the people who elect them, but they are able to engage and work alongside the people who put them into power. That is the only way that the society and the government can work together to be able to confront uncertainty. Because if we continue with a system where those who are in government believe they know everything, they are the ones to lead, they are the ones to come up with decisions, and then the rest of the society just has to comply, they will be faced with the kind of situation that we were faced when it comes to trying to enforce rules around social distancing, when the realities of the people on the ground were not taken into account in putting in place some of those measures. In terms of some of the points that Lucy raised, I do agree that if we have to bring on board issues of technology to assist with our governance, then we have to ensure that we take into account the limited connectivity, as well as some of the challenges that are inherent in processes like electronic voting. So those are some of the things that, some of the debates that still need to be had to see how best such a technology could be integrated into future governance processes. And I also do agree with you, Lucy, that rethinking our education system is also key in order to develop the kind of capacities that are needed to put in place an anticipatory governance framework. Yes, Nima, I think I will end there.
Thank you very much, Fritz. I'm actually going to suggest that we move on to the next section. I want to thank you all three very much for really insightful comments. Fritz, I really like your idea around the social dialogue, especially in a context where we don't have social peace. And Donna's, your points and Lucy's points around sort of a layered approach, thinking very carefully about how one manages a transition like this and build capacity to create anticipatory governance capacities within public service institutions. Jan, I want to suggest then that we move to our next session, and I'm just going to briefly introduce Professor Dewald van Niekerk. He's the head of the African Center for Disaster Studies at the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Northwest University. And the respondent in this session is Professor Roberto Poli from the University of Trento. He has been awarded the UNESCO Chair in Anticipatory Systems, and he teaches future studies and epistemology of the social science and coordinates the master's program in social foresight. So over to you first, please, Dewald. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Dion and your team, and also the sponsors of this research. I would just like to echo the sentiment of my previous colleagues, in the sense that I've found this piece of research quite enjoyable. I'm quite focused on disaster risk governance, and sometimes we don't get the opportunity to look at the more theoretical / abstract environment in which we find ourselves with disaster risk. As you can imagine, is a very practical kind of implementation of certain measures within governance. I first came to looking at anticipation almost by mistake, in the sense that I was asked by the editors of the World Disaster Report a couple of years ago to look at anticipation and disaster risk. And then I was unceremonially ambushed by Professor Poli in doing a chapter for him as well, which was not on the cards, but it got me thinking. And to bring these two together almost feels like going full circle, looking at anticipatory governance and disaster risk reduction, and specifically in a post-COVID-19 environment in which we found ourselves. Now, first of all, the approach that I followed was that I looked at it at anticipatory governance and disaster risk through a very much complex systems approach. In other words, the notion that humans and the systems on which we depend functions within these complex environments. And also that in order for us to understand disaster risk reduction, we need to understand the linkages and the complexity of socio-ecologically linked systems and systems of systems, because we are dealing with the natural environment, we're dealing with unknowns within that, and we're also much more dealing with humans and our ability to manage disaster risks. And what I also subscribe to is a fairly recent notion of that disasters are not natural. We should not be talking about natural disasters. And I know it could sound within the realm of complexity counterintuitive, but by saying that, it forces us to focus on what we as human beings are doing and to realize that a lot of the mistakes that we are making that causes disasters falls within our government's domains. So what is anticipatory governance for disaster risk reduction? Firstly, I looking at our understanding of complex systems to determine various future risks and risk scenarios. It also relates to understanding systemic changes that we might find ourselves in, and then also the change that needs to be present within government structures. And I think the previous speakers adequately touched upon that. It's also looking at identifying different changes and cues of change. Specifically, it might be a shift in our current thinking, our current environment. It could be more long-term. It could be something relating to our slow or even rapid onset hazards, but very much so also within our vulnerability and inequalities that we find within the region. And anticipatory governance for disaster risk reduction, I think, also relates to the need for government structures to change, systemic changes to achieve these ideals that we were talking about today. So anticipatory governance, in my mind, for disaster risk reduction specifically, is also very much related to the broader picture, and that is systems of systems, of foresight, of networks, your collective intelligence and wisdom that needs to be present in order for us to say this is actually anticipatory governance. So within the paper, I painted a bit of a broader picture of what I see the components of anticipatory governance to be. I'm not going to focus on them too much for the sake of time, but there's 5 components. There's 4 that's quite well known within the current literature, and that is foresight system, network system, feedback system, and open mind institutional culture, which we've already talked about. But also then this notion of Auftragstaktik, which is a German way of focusing on military governance or military command and control, although it's not only that. And I found this notion to be quite interesting, because it is not only a way of command and control as we would understand it within the disaster response environment, but it's much more than that. It's a way of, it's an institutional cultural process, which they've used for many years in terms of decision making. And it also relates to your basic leadership, your trust, your training, your skills and your capacities that you might have, but also applying that without the fear of either insubordination, also the fear of any type of consequences behind that. And that relates, I think, much back to the type of governance that we would love to see within the SADC region. Now, what should it do? First of all, anticipatory governance of disaster risk reduction, I think, must foster these systemic understanding of the wicked problems. Our very first speaker touched upon that. And I think it's so incumbent to also focus on that in disaster risk, because those are these wicked problems that sometimes drive the broader risk processes that we find. It's to identify them, it's to find these various solutions, but within development and within resilience thinking processes. It's almost as much of having a blueprint of the future on which we can act upon today. And in the absence of having such a foresight, such a blueprint, it becomes very difficult and abstract to talk about anticipatory governance. And it relates back to what all the speakers have been talked about, and that is the legacy systems that we sit with that is very, very difficult to change and very, very difficult to adapt. So let's look at some of the exposed fault lines within the COVID-19 environment. And I think I'm frozen now. Oh goodness. Dion, can you just check, is that?
We can hear you,
Can you still see me? Can you hear me?
We can see you,
okay,
and
sorry,
we can hear you.
Thanks, I was just frozen on this side for a while. So in the paper, I identify some of these fault lines. First of all, our systems of systems inability to anticipate hazards of such a magnitude. The COVID pandemic caught us all off guard. We've been talking about pandemics, epidemics for many, many years within the SADC region. But as we saw so many other governments throughout the world, it caught us totally off guard, something that we haven't dealt with before. But we must also realize that it's not something that is going to go away. We should now learn from this process, and we need to move forward, inculcate within this anticipatory governance perspective. It also highlighted the inadequate decision-making that we have, and in some instances, we even had institutions almost in paralysis, not being able to cope with this and being able to make fast and quick decisions. Poor structures that we have, the inability to understand complexities between systems I've mentioned, and also the lack of skills and resources and knowledge. And when I say this, I'm not only focusing on the SADC Secretariat, I'm focusing on the member states that also makes up SADC as a whole, because that's what SADC is actually all about. What are some of the lessons that we've learned? Well, obviously we have capacities in the region. We've seen that in many governments that there was a quick response to it, maybe not linked to the best amount of resources that we might have or the best knowledge at the time, but we do have capacities in the region. In the disaster risk environment, there's been a major drive towards ensuring that we build up the academic sector. We focus on the private sector, getting them involved. And we've seen these islands of excellence at local government level that I think did a fair job with, given the circumstances that we find ourselves. What we also learned is that we're not doing a very good job in our risk assessments, and that goes across the board from regional down to local. And I think that my take on that is, my main reason for saying that is it's very difficult for us to compare apples and apples. We sometimes use risk assessments that's extremely abstract and they don't talk throughout levels, which makes the next level, makes it very difficult for them to be using these assessments. And I mean, risk assessment forms the foundation in disaster risk of where you're going, of your anticipatory governance. In that sense, we also need to understand what the first speaker called the black swans, black elephants, black jellyfish, and one that I've learned today was the grey rhinoceros. I'm going to read up a bit more about that. And linked to that is the notion of a multi-early warning system, a multi-hazard early warning system. And that in itself is the manifestation of anticipatory governance, if we have to look at it on a very practical level. And these are things that's not present. There needs to be a more adequate funding mechanism, be that at regional level or escalated down into government. There's been a lot of talk about putting aside a percentage of budget for disaster risk reduction purposes. But there's much talk also about how do we track this. If there's no budgetary line item, it becomes very difficult to track and then obviously to monitor and evaluate. Our intergovernmental intersectoral planning is inadequate, and I think that is still true. And we talked about the bureaucratic systems that does not fully allow for anticipatory governance. So other lessons is the unanticipated knock-on effects that we've seen, socioeconomic knock-on effects. We've seen corruption, seeing the South African environment, things that we could not foresee. We couldn't anticipate this. Also need to address our ability to adapt and to adapt quickly. There's a need to understand the drivers of vulnerability in all its facets, which then in itself becomes a development issue. And then only, I believe, through the systems and resilience thinking approach can we foster anticipatory governance. Now, how should that happen? First of all, I think the addressing the inadequacy of the legacy systems becomes so important. Also to embrace integration and then also uncertainty. It's something that's not very common within governance systems. and the focus on integration and more flexibility within our systems. And all of this, at the end of the day, I think comes down to much more refined resilience thinking that we need to inculcate. Now, within the SADC environment, there's been a major drive to bring resilience into our development thinking and into our governance, in the sense that they've developed a resilience framework. And I think these are some of the good examples, although it comes from a more disaster risk nuanced environment, that we can adopt within other environments to achieve anticipatory governance. Yeah, I hope I've made up a bit of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dewald. Professor Pauly, are you ready to respond, please? Roberto, we can't hear you. Oh dear. Okay, I see we've lost Professor Pauly just for a second there. Dewald, I think we've got a question here for you. I'm going to proceed with the question, and perhaps we'll hopefully get Professor Pauly back pretty soon. The question is, resilience and disaster risk reduction is really focused on bouncing back, so on recovery, and not on adaptive capacity and transformation. How can we shift the conversation around future resilience and align them with and align it with anticipatory governance frameworks?
Thanks. Thanks for the question, Uma. I've done quite a bit of work in the resilience domain, and I think the notion of resilience just about bouncing back is absolutely wrong. Resilience means the ability to almost steer a ship through very turbulent water. In other words, it plays directly into anticipatory governance. I think it's wrong for us to think resilience means it's an ability that we have that is only activated by responding to something. That is not, I don't think that is true. There's a lot of new thinking around resilience. And if we look at the notion that it is not bouncing back, but bouncing forward within an environment of complexity, within an environment of, let's say in disaster risk environment, of multiple hazards and massive vulnerability that we sit within the region. It's navigating those very difficult areas and finding a way of reducing our risk and becoming more resilient at the end of the day. So I hope that addresses the question directly. So I don't see it as a disaster response issue at all.
Thank you. That's actually, it's a nice segue into the next question, because I think you've partly answered it now. So the next question was really, do you see an opportunity to integrate disaster risk governance and anticipatory governance frameworks? I think you've largely answered that, but is there anything else that you would like to add to that?
No, I hope I did answer that. I think there's been quite a drive in getting people from various sectors and disciplines to look at what they are doing through a disaster risk reduction lens. I always tease and say the disaster managers should be very concerned, because if everyone switches on to the notion of disaster risk reduction, they'll be out of a job. And I think that is what we need to achieve. That disaster risk must become inculcated into all our thinking, driven by a development agenda. And if everyone starts thinking about this, our need for response will lessen. Our disaster risk, which we will start to address, will be heightened. So definitely, I think this anticipatory governance, it plays so well into the whole ambit of the risk reduction component we've been trying to push for the past 20 years now in the international arena.
Okay, that's interesting, because there's a very nice comment here that says some of the most interesting work on resilience comes from the field of social ecological systems, that defines resilience as the capacity of a system to deal with change and continue to develop. Thus, not only does resilience entail the capacity to persist or recover, and adapt, but also to innovate and transform. Essentially, the capacity to deal with transformative change. I think you probably would agree with that assessment.
Oh, absolutely. There's quite a number of resilience characteristics. In my recent research, I listed almost 25 different characteristics. Some of them are redundant. But if you start to think about how these different themes that we talk about connects within the broader spectrum of complexity and complex adaptive systems, they all fit in so nicely. But when you try and make them very practical, one thing jumps out, and that is that our legacy systems does not allow for this. And I think it was Professor Poli that mentioned this. There needs to be a massive change if we want to achieve anticipatory governance. I don't foresee that we can just make tweaks on the current systems and achieve this. It needs to be a new way of looking at how we govern.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm very happy to see Professor Poli is back with us. Professor Poli, over to you.
Thank you. The network is very unstable. Anyway, I'm in full agreement with what Dever wrote in his paper. So my question is very simple. How can we help a legacy system to shift from a reactive to an anticipatory way of doing things? I know that's a big question, but I mean, any suggestions would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Poli. Yes, it's a difficult question. If I have to look at how we've managed to bring the disaster risk discussion into governance, it was a gradual process, but it was, I think, allowing people to understand the bigger picture, and also the ability to latch onto bigger conversations like climate change and climate change adaptation, which still dominates the field. And a lot of the funding, a lot of the thinking, a lot of the government structures goes towards this. So I think that this gradual change that we need to try and achieve is to not say, okay, we're going to throw out everything. Obviously, there needs to be some significant changes, but maybe to see how these changes can be established within government structures in the sense of how they do things. So there's, I think, on a very practical level, people feel immediately threatened if you want to change a system. It would be wonderful if one of our political leaders, presidents, would come in and they would change the cabinet to such an extent that it focuses on the social vulnerability within our community and communities, and do everything that they do in terms of development around that. But it's not going to happen. So I think it's to find that windows, that entry points into what government is already doing, and then try and push the anticipatory agenda. And I think to make it practical will make it easier for people to adapt, and then a gradual shift will happen. I don't think it's going to be a switch that we flick, but I think in that kind of way, it might help to get the anticipatory governance agenda into the broader government structures.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. On that note, unfortunately, I have to conclude the session. I think we do need to move on to our next session because we're running slightly, well, actually quite a bit behind time now. Dion, are you happy for me to very quickly introduce our speakers, or are you ready to take over?
I got rid of my issue eventually. Sorry about the huge issue I had. No, sure. I can introduce our next session and speakers. We really now hope to open up the floor a little bit, have some of our experts speak to these issues, and but first we would love to hear from a case study that we have from Demos Helsinki, and we've got the senior consultant there, Miriam Bensky, that would present some of the work they're actually doing in this space, and through a case study that she'll be sharing with us. And in that sense, I need to now open the document for her, because I got the document here with me, and I'll just quickly start sharing my screen.
Thanks so much for the tech support, Dion. Much appreciated, and good afternoon or morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, and really a fabulous opportunity to be part of this joint reflection. We're especially happy to continue the discussions we have with our dear friends, Piret and her team at the OECD, who really have been driving the anticipatory governance innovation discourse. Just a few quick words of introduction. Dion, I think we can view your sort of speaker view of the presentation. I think there might be a display setting to change. Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay, I'm working on that. Let me just let me quickly, sorry, I don't know, on my side it looked right, so
no
sorry.
Worries. No worries. In the meantime, I'll just share a few quick words of introduction about Demos Helsinki. We are a think tank, but we like to think of ourselves as a little bit more of a do tank. Thank you. This looks great now. Thanks, Dion. So as a do tank, a lot of our work focuses on essentially collaborating with public institutions around the world, from Brazil to Tanzania, Australia, India, and across Europe on public sector innovation. And I'll be talking to you today about Finland as a bit of a case study. So before going into it, I actually just wanted to preface what I'll be sharing with you by saying that this is meant more as sort of prompts for thought, not necessarily as a kind of, or definitely not as a framework that one should or could try to replicate elsewhere. The Finnish context is definitely unique, as are all contexts. But if you want to move forward, actually 2 slides, Dion. And next. Perfect, thank you. Excellent. So as we've heard from earlier speakers today, the pandemic has really been a sort of kind of like a moment of reckoning for many governments. Some have decided to hold on stubbornly to their role as safeguarding stability, while others are daring to use the crisis moment to actually proactively transform governance. And if you think about it, the political commitment to transformation is actually the easy part. So for example, in Finland, the current government is aiming to be the world's first carbon neutral welfare state by 2035. But this kind of visionary political commitment alone is really not worth much without a governance system that would be capable of driving and delivering such transformation. So thinking back to Professor Anthony Newkirk's earlier question about how do you sell anticipatory innovation governance to decision makers, I would say that the really tricky question is actually how to sell it to civil servants. Now, that requires quite some important mindset shifts in the way that governments function. And I'll talk you through 3 core areas of anticipatory governance in Finland, where there are these types of mindset shifts happening right now. The 3 areas, you can stay on the slide, actually. Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. So the 3 areas are foresight, governmental steering, and transformative capacities. And foresight, of course, is an important backbone of any anticipatory system. And what you're looking at here is actually a visualization of the Finnish national foresight ecosystem. As is evident, it's quite dispersed, decentralized, and non-hierarchical. Those are, of course, core strengths of the system. It's thereby very inclusive and diverse. But as one can imagine, it's quite difficult to link such a dispersed system to decision-making. But actually, the most important mindset shift that is happening in the Finnish foresight ecosystem is about moving away from a focus on only trying to forecast very narrowly, forecast and plan for the most probable developments, towards a much more bold reimagining and exploration of possible alternative opportunities and futures ahead, and perhaps even to try to define desirable futures. And this question leads us to the second area of mindset shifts, which is happening on the level of governmental steering. This shift is actually about moving away from a sort of top-down steering model into a more networked policymaking model. And one such approach that we've developed with the Finnish Prime Minister's Office is a so-called humble approach to policymaking. And a humble governance approach is actually about experimentalist governance. So the aim is to structure policymaking processes as a sort of continuous investigation of different options that are then tested and iterated in the contexts where they will be implemented. And you might be wondering, okay, what kind of steering does this humble governance offer, if any? And I would say that as compared to the very prescriptive traditional steering, humble governance sets a more humble goal, which is about aiming for a thin consensus on some kind of shared direction and values. And based on that, various actors can then iteratively further explore possible avenues. And the third mindset shift is actually happening in the capacities of government. And that, is basically the ways of working in the public sector. These new models of reimagination and steering require a whole different operational culture. So aiming for, controlled risk-taking, permission to fail, creativity, imagination, openness. And this was actually also recognized by the Finnish government last year in their strategy for public governance renewal for the decade ahead. The strategy commits the government to quite a radical new culture based on participatory policymaking, agility and challenging oneself, and actually even intergenerational responsibility to respect the boundaries of nature and deal with the climate crisis. And being mindful of time, I just want to leave you with a couple of final thoughts. Next slide, please. And these are just what I consider probably the most crucial questions that one needs to ask oneself when we talk about mindset shifts that are necessary for anticipatory governance. The core questions are: whose vision of the future are we privileging, consciously or unconsciously? How can we contextualize trends and signals of change to local knowledge and history? And thereby, how can we make sure not to reinforce dominant global narratives of what progress is? And finally, I would always err on the side of making space for and specifically seeking out diverse and divergent experiences and views. And I'll wrap it up here and look forward to continuing the conversation through the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Let me now introduce our next speaker as well, and just the end of the slideshow. Our next speaker is a dear friend of mine, as well as a key futurist in South Africa and across the world. And Tanya is the chief strategist and futurist at Tanya and associate Agihert and Associates, as well as a research associate and a co-founding member of the Foresight for Development platform. And we'd like to now just move into her presentation. Thank you so much, Miriam, for your presentation as well.
Hello, Dion. I assume I can be heard, so I'm just going to leap straight into it. 10 minutes is very little because this is such a stunning topic and subject area to talk about. So I'm just going to share a few comments about what is happening in practice. Okay, luckily this is SADC. It's not at the state level in terms of anticipatory governance. It's also not proper anticipatory governance, but it's the beginnings of some exercises. It's at the regional level. It is some work that was done at the end of last year. It's still ongoing with the Western Cape Department of Agriculture. So essentially what had happened is they were responding to both indications of expected change. And that's what you can see depicted in the cartoon here. You know, this is steady change that we kind of know is coming our way. A lot of it, of course, is critical convergent crises, but then combined with that is sudden change, depicted by this little metaphor that everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. So this was the ask. Let me just go to the ask. There we go. This was the ask from the Department of Agriculture in the Western Cape, commissioning a study to look at post-COVID futures of Western Cape agriculture, agri-processing sector. So it's all up and down the value chain of a rather large sector, a big economic chunk of the province, where they were asking identify innovations, trends, and importantly, trend breaks, because, you know, a trend is a trend until it bends. Identify potential black elephants. We have that terminology again. For a number of reasons, we decided to start calling it rather predictable surprises. It's the elephant in the room, the things we don't like talking about, the disruptors that we can foresee, and generate a range of possible futures. And these futures were supposed to be very far, 30 years into the future. And then critically identify potential interventions for all role players. This was very inclusive right from scratch. So if one goes back to anticipatory governance, just a definition quickly, this is from Meiderman, and I see both Antonie and Diebold referred to Meiderman, and principles. These principles, and this is based on some desk research work we did for the project, that builds on Firth and Faber's three-part strategy for anticipatory governance, and both authors, discussants, also referred to Firth and Faber's work. So essentially, these principles integrate foresight and policy, practice long-termism, I can say that, incorporate a complex systems perspective, harness collective intelligence, a networked governance approach, and distributed capabilities. And that's what's so fantastic about the work happening at and the OECD, sort of specifically looking at that. This sort of saying about think like a system, act like an entrepreneur. It needs specific skill sets, and then practice adaptive learning, and sort of, start getting into that feedback system of what it is you're doing and what's working and what not. That also, of course, contributes to resilience. So essentially, I just quickly want to touch on one or two of these and to show people what this looks like in practice. So I'm not going to go into the outputs or the findings or the whatever of this work. I'm literally just going to do a little bit of a show and tell. The work is publicly available, not on huge release at the moment, because the Western Cape would like to properly launch this work together with an implementation plan that's being worked on right now. So the report is available, but not for heavy distribution. But it will all become public in time. Okay, so essentially to answer the research questions, they'd 1 to 4 there, what we did is we sort of put together a project using a range of futures, foresight methods, tools, and approaches. So that would then speak to principles of integrating foresight together with what would ultimately become policy making and this practice of long-termism. So a little start to where all of the methods and tools that we went through were participative. So from scanning and driver mapping, surveying a whole lot of people, a whole lot of stakeholders in the sector, futures wheels for disruptors and potential shocks. And just to mention, some of those were disaster ones. So, one of the future wheels that were played out, and participative means this was sort of between 20 and 30 people for each workshop, coming from a whole lot of different parts of the Western Cape agriculture and agri-processing sector. So, everything from people representing the fruit canning industry to the sort of deciduous fruit growers associations, some labor representation, other government players. It was sort of really a beautiful, wonderful, diverse mixed bag of people that went through the sort of journey together for some weeks. Some of the shocks we played out was consistently unpredictable, chaotic, destructive, extreme weather. Because there's a slight difference between you're able to foresee if you've got good climate change modeling and sort of at the micro level, can you foresee the impact of climate change? Another one was the Western Cape is unable, for whatever reason, to export its produce. So we had great fun with that. A set of inductive scenarios looking really at the much longer term, 3 horizons frameworks that looks at systemic change and specifically working with what we call seeds, pockets of the future in the present. And then, of course, using that second horizon to come up with interventions. And then instead of any kind of logic modeling or regular strategic planning, it's sort of causal loop diagrams and analysis when it came to the interventions. So just as part of the show and tell, this was participative driver mapping, and you can see examples of some of the drivers. These are only social, technological, and environmental. There's a whole nother set, of course, which are political, economic, and values, but people sort of collectively going through the exercise of saying, what are the things that cause change to happen in the sector going forward. Here's our example of the future wheels and the shocks playing those out. So everybody had to imagine that in the future, the fourth industrial revolution technology has created massive inequalities. And then what are the sort of the impacts of the impacts, the third and second order consequences of that, and sort of participatively come up with that kind of work. Here's an example of the Three Horizons work that was done participatively. And this one referred to the sector is able to react to and deal with climate change, and it's actually proactive about climate smart agriculture, what needs to happen to enable that systemic shift, that kind of conversation. This is the example of the sort of the morphological scenario where we created building blocks, and these are color coded. So these are themes. You can see the theme, one of them is technology, another theme political, another one climate again, issues around knowledge transfer, skills transfer, and then market access. And where collectively people sort of played out by picking different building blocks of different outcomes to see what kind of futures could emerge. So that was sort of looking at incorporating long-termism and taking a foresight approach to starting to come up with policy. The beautiful stuff of this now is the implementation plan is being worked on right now, which is super cool actually. And then this attempt to incorporate a complex systems perspective. And what that really revolved around was using causal loop diagrams with narratives to describe. So causal loop diagrams, really sort of these positive and negative ones, describing vicious and virtuous circles, and taking the sort of systemic approach to looking at where are the domains of change. And there's some of the examples: Africa's rise, fourth industrial revolution technology, governance, policy uncertainty, climate change. And then, of course, one of the leverage points where the department actually has got influence is agricultural education knowledge transfer. These domains each had inflection points where things could either go one way or the other. And we played out all of those. It's another very interesting way of doing scenarios, by the way. And what you can see on this diagram here is just, for example, climate change. So imagining and saying that there is intervention from the department and all role players, that sustainable and climate smart agriculture production starts happening. And then you see what that sort of kicks off. It reduces water chemical energy use. It increases the ability to match consumer demand for these kind of more sustainable products, ethical products. It reduces environmental degradation. There's an influence in terms of trade balance, less import, more export. It increases competitiveness and swings right back down to eventually that then enabling more resilience, flexibility, adaptability of the sector. And so that sort of conversation happening on the back of that, starting to take policy decisions. So my time is up, my slides are up, and I end just sort of, there is a lovely sort of little extract of the work, which is saying, so what does that preferred future look like for Western Cape agriculture? It's sustainable, it's resilient, and it's equitable, and there's sort of a little bit of an unpacking of what that involves. And I can stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Very interesting look behind the scenes of what's happening in practical implementation of anticipatory governance. I'd now like to just open the floor with the other panelists that has joined us. So we have Pierrette from the OECD, we've got Professor Roberto Polli and Donna DuPont, as well as Pierre Skoenraad that you've seen in the video as well. And we'd now like to unpack some of the questions that have maybe, or comments on the two presentations they just heard on the case studies, or within the larger scheme of things. And we also have some questions we have emerging from the audience that we are seeing. So whoever wants to start first to start addressing some interesting point of views, please go ahead.
If I may?
Yes.
Okay, if I were high-level public officials, I would likely say, what's the novelty? we can already do all what has been said today. There is a missing piece here. Of course, okay, we may learn to be slightly less directive and learn to be more participatory. That's okay. We can do some more foresight. Okay, but these are all things we already do. At least most governments do. So there is something more that must be understood in order to begin unpacking the idea of anticipatory governance. And what's lacking is not the idea that we are surrounded by many changes. Because if you think a little bit, there have never been a period in the history of humankind without changes. Okay, there have been periods with more changes and periods that were quieter, no doubt about that. And we can also say that our period, I mean, is characterized by many, many changes. Okay, but that's not enough, because changes are the normal situation. There is something more. And eventually the issue is that changes are faster and faster and faster. It is the acceleration of transformations that creates problems, that creates uncertainty, that shows that legacy systems that have been very effective in the past are no more able to keep the pace, to follow the accelerated transformations. That's why, in my understanding at least, anticipatory governance is needed. Is developing tools for dealing with transformations that are faster and faster and faster. And that implies the adoption of a new framework. That also shows that anticipatory governance cannot be something that is implemented by decree from one day to the next. It's something that takes time. It's something that requires the development of new skills, new capacities, new rules. And all these take a lot of time and efforts and knowledge. So it's much more, I would say, complex than expected. And of course, a strategic foresight framework is part of the game, no doubt, but it's not reducible to strategic foresight. Of course, futures literacy is part of the game, no doubt, obviously, but there is much more than that. And I think that we have to dig deeper in these aspects. An anticipatory framework, an anticipatory governance framework is not a slightly modernized kind of reactive governance, of traditional governance. It's something completely different. And the effort for moving from one framework to the other one, well, they are not so easy. They take time, energy, intelligence, capacities, vision, and so on and so forth. So I think that the danger we risk, and here I stop, the danger we risk is to think about anticipatory governance as a slightly amended form of traditional governance. That's not the case. It's something radically different. At least that's the way I understand things. I may be wrong. I hope to be wrong.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Roberto. Please engage with the discussion further. I don't want to be steering anything. Panelists can go ahead and just contribute, and then we can ask some questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Dion. If I may come in here, I want to link up to the two concepts that Miriam as well as Professor Pauly just raised, and that is the issue of humility and how difficult it is. And if one wants to engage with the future, sometimes it's good to go back into the past to specific points in time. And I love to go back to 2007 just before the iPhone was released and just before the global financial crisis. And the question is then, if we as this very same esteemed panel places ourselves back in 2007 and have this very same discussion, how much of what we would have said then would have value in 2001? It just shows us how difficult it is, because we may have spoken about the 1 billion customers of Nokia. We would have spoken about SMS technology. We would have spoken about what a sustained growth of 6% would be do to deal with inequality. But it was also a time where Facebook was the only social media platform. And would we have foreseen the role of social media and the impact on democracy itself? So those are some of the issues that we need to consider and understand that when we proceed with humility. The second quick point I want to make on how difficult it is, and I had the privilege of being involved at SADC level with a number of workshops on Foresight, is we do compete with very fixed and very rigid planning systems, and very much influenced by the donor world, log frames, 5-year planning, very specific targets, and then the auditing of those. So we have a situation where risk aversion is embedded in the system. And if we want to free up our imagination and potential and preferred futures, we need to deal, and there I fully support Professor Pauly, we need to fundamentally deal with the way that we approach planning, monitoring and evaluation, as well as budgeting within the SADC region. Let me stop for there and allow other panelists to also contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting comments as well. What I wanted to also kind of stress is that what I see happening as well, because we deal a lot with systemic transformation, is this kind of complexity paralysis that, as was said as well, anticipatory governance is difficult. We're dealing with uncertainty, and there are so many different kind of components about how to kind of build a new governance system while the previous system is still working. So how to change the wheels on a bus while the bus still has to get the kids to school. So, you have systems running. So all of this is very difficult, but it shouldn't be also paralyzing. So we should have kind of these levers, interventions, and starting points of where we actually start to actively demonstrate that anticipatory governance methodologies are possible. And from our perspective, at least, we don't say that every single thing has to be run in government from an anticipatory perspective. I think that I think that every single policy could benefit from an anticipatory approach, that it could accompany traditional policy making measures, because it helps to stress test your policy approaches. It helps to look for different opportunity scenarios, or even kill off policies that are not useful anymore. So it's useful in many regards to existing policies as well. But not all kind of units or policy makers in government have to have a kind of a uniformly anticipatory approach. A similar level of capacity would be good across government. But do we have to have kind of futurists or teams of innovation units everywhere in the public sector? That is debatable, because there's a lot of also administrative work that remains within the public sector as well, and also about the kind of the day-to-day business that has to uphold. And now I think that the really question is how to structure that. So you have both the things that have to be done, but also the paradigmatic thinking that says maybe we're doing the wrong things. And human beings as we are, the same people don't like to do the thinking. So if you are committed on doing a mission or you have a strategic plan that needs implementation, it is actually very difficult to say, I may be wrong. There might be other alternatives. So how to actually structure that and do that well, so you have a feedback loop. So you have both the kind of the anticipatory, radical thinking, experimentation, innovation going on as well, but also sometimes very strong commitment towards issues. And another point I wanted to also make is that the kind of the argument of fast-paced change has, it's being used quite a lot, and I fully agree that in some areas, the fast-paced change is really a kind of the core issue of anticipation. But on the other hand, we have issues like climate change. I mean, we have known about the issue of sustainability and climate change forever, almost, and we're still not acting. And we're not still taking on board that kind of the absolute potentiality of these changes having a radical impacts to us as well. It really is about both the kind of the long-term knowledge and taking that on board, to actually acknowledging that these things are possibly quite dire that we're going to face, versus the kind of the really black swan events, which are actually quite rare, that we cannot foresee at all happening. So there's a little bit of complexity there, but I would say don't get scared about the complexity. It is worth to start actually demonstrating and showing that it is possible. And we are doing it in different countries already. So, the first forerunners are already implementing these things. So it shouldn't be something that you are afraid of or scared about.
I'm happy to jump in next. So I'm going to take more of a systems perspective, especially, during the pandemic. I had an opportunity to do some research, and it's available. It's called Anticipation, Emergency and Disaster Management. And it has emergency managers and military professionals all over the world that engaged in this Foresight project. I think one of the things that I learned from that project was about systems, is looking for the rules and in the system, because the rules of the system are the power points and the leverage points of the system. And they're great places to take a look at how decisions are being made. And as I dove deep into that archetypal pattern of fixes that fails and understanding the risk management lens, the planning paradigm, what I was noticing was that there was this resistance to change. Despite the shifting environment, there was this focus on keeping the same structures that they are comfortable with, right? And to not be open to change, regardless of the risks, regardless of the consequences. So there seems to be this lack of awareness of the consequences of staying in a status quo position with their frameworks when the world and the contextual environment is changing. So I thought that was really important, because that speaks to why, there's a lack of acknowledgement of these, risk frameworks that have significant blind spots, but yet there's not that interest in methodologies to help fill in the gaps. So I think there's a big shift that needs to happen, a recognition of the limitations of the existing methods that are being used, and also a mindset shift about what anticipation is, right? And how it extends beyond a predictive forecasting model. And another aspect, another archetypal pattern that I dove deeply into was shifting the burden. And we do that a lot in our system broadly, where it's all about the quick fixes. And especially in like a pandemic situation, yes, we have a lot of emergency and disaster managers working in public sector, in military, humanitarian organizations, but they all, at the top of that hierarchy of command is the political system and politicians. And so they work in 4-year election cycles. So there's an embedded short-termism in the model. And so it becomes this intervention of quick fixes, again, without a real discussion on what are the long-term fundamental solutions, what are the growing vulnerabilities that we're not acknowledging. We're just plugging in the system and we're constantly doing these quick fixes. And then that ties it into the whole legislative part of the work I dug into as well, because I pulled apart the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act. And a lot of it, again, is very reactive, and it doesn't allow for this new policy that's coming down from the global level about disaster risk management, resilience building. It's very much responding to threats. There's a threat, you wait until it hits a threshold, You know, so it's not even a weak signal. You don't even notice there's a weak signal in the system. You wait until it's like an emergency, and then you deploy all your resources. And so everything is really structured in our legislative pieces, in our economic funding models, in our political systems. It's all short-termism. And so we're really battling against this, right? And there's a lot of rigidity to change. And I think that rigidity and that unwillingness to change is because there's a lot of power in the existing system. And by shifting the system, we're shifting the power dynamics. And I think there's a lot of discomfort with that. And so, but I don't know what the path forward is to have that conversation, but I think that's an important conversation that needs to happen moving forward.
Would someone like to continue this discussion or take it further? Tanya, Miriam, you're welcome to add to the discussion, as well as our authors of the 3 papers. And then we'll continue a little bit later in the session with answering some questions.
Dion, I'm happy just to be a little bit flippant and throw a little bit of a cat into the pigeons or into the bush or whatever it is you do, and just say that often there's nothing like a good crisis or a shock, and to help jolt governments and hierarchies and legacy systems out of the complacency. And you know, Antonia and I are busy in the chat box here around post, you know, the black elephant. It's a play on the black swan from Nicholas Taleb, where it's the black swan is an unknown because the European colonists couldn't imagine that something like that ever existed until they got onto a ship and sailed to Australia, and lo and behold, there was a black swan. So it actually does exist. And as Pierre was saying, it's very rare. Black elephant, it's the elephant in the room. Of course, we need to find a little bit better terminology for this, but there is some lovely work where this is explained, referring to post-normal, and the P&L is post-normal lag, Antonia. I've just found that. And that is that sort of perpetual sense of denialism. And that sort of is the revert to the normality. But in a way, and COVID has shown us, you know, maybe is history. And that we are fully, properly in the post-normal, and that these shocks and crises are the one thing that might, I don't know, jolt us out of the post-normal lag, the denialism. So in that sense, COVID is a good thing. That was the cat pigeons.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I'll jump in as well. This actually makes me a little bit sad, because I do love a crisis. I do love a really good crisis. And just we started to work on anticipatory innovation before at the observatory before the crisis, long before. It was a tough sell. I think we got 5 countries, lead countries, to say yes, this is important. After the crisis hit, I think we had all of our partner countries on the phone saying, I think we need more of this. This is really like the window of opportunity to implement something like that. So crisis is useful for that. But it also makes me quite sad in a sense that, the crisis has made an opportunity for many things that have existed already for 20, 30 years that are potentially making the public sector better only now. And I'm also a little bit pessimistic, because we just came from a 2007, 2008, one of the largest financial crises in the world that affected all economies. And yet, in a couple of years afterwards, we were still talking about normal. Governments went back into the business as usual, and it had much less of an effect than we actually think. So it's really a question about how to keep the urgency going, to say that even if they realize that the next crisis is coming, they still want to ignore it. And I really love the question, one of the questions in the chat about, so who is anticipatory governance for? Is the capacity, should it be with the civil servants or should it be with the politicians? I think that really the answer is both. It's some of the work that we're doing in Finland as well, where the core issues of civil servants being kind of the continuity in different reform areas. But they of course have their own biases and sometimes agendas as well. But they're also cut off in many ways if there's no political commitment or true to the policy cycles themselves. So the understanding has to be on both sides, and also the urgency buy-in has to be on both sides as well. So it's something that we're struggling at the moment to actually deal with.
I missed the moment when everybody's hands went up when Tanya was talking. So the person that was first, I don't know who that was. Please go ahead. We've got Donna, Miriam, Dewald, and Antoni's hands. Thank you.
My hand went up first, if I may, unless I must do the gentleman thing.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so it was me who asked that question, who needs the toolkit most? And I want to tell two very quick stories after what Peter just said. 2 or 3 years ago in our region, Cyclone Idai made landfall in Beira, which is in the middle of Mozambique, with devastating consequences for many communities and countries. I'm sure that Dewald can tell the story better. But what struck me was, as it was about to happen, as you could watch those maps on CNN and other news channels, one of our ministers came from a SADC meeting and at the airport answered the journalists, and she said, "Yes, it looks like a real big problem, but we didn't know it was going to happen." I'm quoting her. When there are dedicated weather stations in the Indian Ocean that can tell decision makers what is going to come. The second one is, many of my colleagues and friends were part of this technical mission to Cabo Delgado to develop a technical report for what SADC might or might not be able to do to counter the scourge of violent extremism. SADC is yet to make a decision. The decision makers, the politicians, the presidents delayed a summit indefinitely to make the decision for political reasons. And so my question is, if we take this program into SADC, into Southern Africa, and help decision makers to improve decision-making processes, structures, systems, and so on, who do we target? And who do we influence? And then critically, how? So what is the EU experience, for example? Does the EU Parliament and the EU Commission, take anticipatory governance serious? And the politicians who are short-termists and opportunists, do they also take this serious? Thank you very much.
I think this is a question to the panel directly, so anybody, the part of this panel can go for it. Roberto, just unmute yourself, please.
Sorry. Very shortly, the European Commission, for the first time in its history, has appointed a vice president to strategic foresight. This is one of the big news that almost nobody has noticed. And Maroš Šefčovič, who is the person in charge of the role, has written to all European governments asking them to nominate their minister of the future. This is something still not publicly known, but the meeting of the ministers will be in 2 weeks, well, 1 week's time, May 17th. So something is happening. There is a long way. I mean, many other things should, but there is something that is happening. Still not open to the public, so to say, but there are changes in the way in which at least that institution is beginning to work. If successful or not is too early to know, obviously, but there is a trial for trying to do something in the direction, and anticipatory governance is one of the 4 catching words, so catching sentences at the level of the European Commission. One is anticipatory governance. The second one is policy coherence or dynamical policy coherence. The third one is resilience. And the fourth one is sustainable development. They are trying to develop a policy around these four ideas. Again, they may succeed or they may fail. We do not know. But nevertheless, there are some serious discussions around these issues. So that's something that may eventually play a role. We will see.
Thank you, Roberto. Donna or Devald, I don't know, you can go ahead. And then Miriam also had her hand up. Thank you.
I'm happy to jump
Donna
in.
can go.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So I just want to pick up on that post-normal times, post-normal science concept. I'm a big practitioner of post-normal times. I love it. And I think it's really interesting because the post-normal science is all about this transition period where old orthodoxies of a previous paradigm are dying. New ones have not been born yet. And we're in this messy middle where nothing makes sense. And so we're in a paradigm shift and people talk about it, but they don't understand that a paradigm shift, fundamentally to change a paradigm, you're changing the mental model of the system. You're having different goals for the emerging paradigm. And so I think people have a hard time living and working in the current paradigm, the day-to-day stresses and responsibilities, and then creating space to reimagine the emerging paradigm and the new opportunities that are potentially waiting for us in the future. So I think this is a cognitive challenge that we're in, but I think there's an opportunity here to recognize the paradigm aspect, and the most powerful intervention point is a paradigm shift, and it's shifting the new goals of the system. If you start to change the goal of the system, then all of the rules, all of the self-organization, all of the information flows, all of it lines up towards the new goals. So the question becomes, what's the new future goal of this paradigm that we're moving towards? And I think that aligns beautifully with a lot of the work in anticipatory futures around visioning and creating that space to really think about the possibility and how we can transform systems. And so I'm really excited about that. And then picking up on the black swan, black elephant, black jellyfish, there's been a lot of dialogue in the emergency management community and even futures community about whether COVID-19 is a black elephant. And so, or sorry, black swan. And it was really interesting early on. It was a lot of dialogue around it. I wasn't convinced because I was a pandemic planner. I've done scenario planning. So to me, it wasn't an unknown, but what was it? And a lot of my work, my research, talking to emergency managers and military professionals, they identified the COVID pandemic as a black jellyfish. What is a black jellyfish? A black jellyfish is a situation that can emerge and that can rapidly escalate and cause systemic instability on a massive scale. And so rapid scale is an important part of that feature. And that's what we're dealing with. We see the pandemic playing out. It's a black jellyfish. It's creating a lot of disruption, and it's a paradigm shaking kind of metaphor for a very deep level of uncertainty. And so again, it gets back to the importance of integrating and working with uncertainty with organizations, because a lot of times that's not even factored in. Again, they're thinking very much forecasting, predictive mindset, and there's many different ways to work with uncertainty and to normalize uncertainty. Because I know in my profession, okay, so I work with a lot of special operation force, I work with emergency management professionals. The culture doesn't allow to even talk about uncertainty. You have to be certain, because you're in a position of command and control. You have to be very certain. If you talk about uncertainty, then you're deemed incompetent. So there's a cultural, element here around, we need to normalize that, yes, there is uncertainty, and that maybe you will be more confident about certain aspects of your knowledge, but you need to understand that it's operating in a world that is dynamic, it's shifting, and there is uncertainty. And it's not about, you know, it's about recognizing that, and it's about having the tools to say, this is how we're going to work with uncertainty in a constructive way. And so I think those are some big opportunities as well moving forward.
Thank you. I think Miriam and then Pierre, thank you.
I'll be very quick, thank you. Actually following up on Donna's important point about sort of being between paradigms and the need for new vision. One important perspective to keep in mind is that systems and institutions, as someone famously said, don't change because it's the right thing to do. They change because there is a well-articulated alternative vision. And I think that's something that we really have to ask ourselves, where that vision is going to come from and what role various actors in society have in forming that new vision. That's all I wanted to add. Thanks.
Thanks. I also just wanted to highlight the fact that with COVID, the opposite also happened. And that is, we reverted back to a default of just depending on experts with very little participation in decision making. So when there is a crisis like this, sometimes the opposite can also happen. And I think that links back to Miriam's point just now, because we didn't have a well-articulated vision and a way of going forward. Maybe lastly, in conclusion, is we must also recognize that we have done some parts of anticipatory governance very well, but we've not been able to inculcate it into government systems. A very good example is the Montfleur scenarios that were developed at the beginning of the South African democracy. It's in so many textbooks, everyone is looking at it, yet we ended up in the lame duck or in the Icarus scenario. So we were not able to do something with those scenarios to actually achieve the ideal scenario. And that's the other warning, is that if we do it half-heartedly, we may actually end up where we planned not to be. Thank you.
Yes, and I think we've addressed some of the questions in the chat as well. Let's try and wrap the conversation up with everyone that wants to just add to the conversation. I think what would be useful is to now just centralize our answers towards the specifically SADC point of view. I know it's difficult, but it has been the huge challenge of the authors to try and situate this body of knowledge and practice in the Southern African continent and context. So yeah, with that in mind, let's just try and wrap things up. Some last point of views or recommendations or practical insights could be useful. Thank you.
One final sentence. I do not think that politicians are very different from lay people. There are only slight wars, but they're more or less the same. If there will be a request from the society, from lay people, of developing a long-term vision, politicians will follow. So the issue is how to spread, how to develop a vision within society, involving as many people as possible. This is where futures literacy may help, in helping millions of people, persons, to develop a vision of the future. And if that happens, institutions will follow, more or less, but will follow. So this is also a way of giving, I mean, a deep robustness to participatory issue. Otherwise, it's only something that works for small groups. So I think the task for everybody of us, for all of us, is how to learn to think about the future and to use the future in all what we do every day in our life. And if these habits became normal, there will be consequences after that.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you very much. Tanya, I think your hand was up. Thank you.
Yes, and I'm going to latch straight on what Roberto was saying and just take it a step further. And again, speak from practical experience. So, you know, Roberto is saying if everyone just learned how to use the future and started articulating and working, putting the criticality of the future forward, I couldn't agree more, because we're doing tiny little fractions of it in SADC, to be honest. Yes, there are examples. And I've just been involved with wonderful work in Botswana, where we were playing out, again, we were playing out little mini risk scenarios. So a whole lot of government people were saying, well, that futures wheel that you saw, one of the examples of what if there's a massive oil spill in the Okavango? And then, you know, the what if of that, and then the learnings from that. And what you see there, people loved it. They enjoyed it. It's stimulating. It's a different way of working. And so yes, I am an advocate of let's just, you know, start walking and the road comes up to meet you. And we should just be doing a lot more of what Roberto's been saying in SADC. So yes. Oh, and I'm so sorry. I need to say hello and thank you and goodbye to everybody, Dion, and then please forgive me, especially Roberto. I need to jump and jump onto another call. Would that be all right?
Yes, thank you, Tanya. Thank you for your contribution and your presentation.
Okay, thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.
Yes, maybe that you were the start of all of this in your presentation. Maybe you'd like to wrap up some ideas or thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, listening to the whole workshop in its entirety, something really stuck with me, what was also around the regional hegemon, or kind of leader within the region itself. And I think what we are seeing with the emerging world, or maybe some anticipation is needed around that as well, is that they're actually, the future world, the future paradigm is complex in many ways, that you can actually run things centrally, but there's going to be polarity and quite a lot of divergence within different approaches. And I think that's especially true in the anticipation as well, that there may be some topical areas that certain countries in your region are very interested in, while others are not. But I don't think that it should stop you from acting. So if you are kind of try to really implement the kind of anticipatory innovation approach within the SADC region, I would really think about the variable geometry or geography of the approach itself, is to apply within topics that are really important to different countries, a different type of approach as well, and really demonstrate by success that indeed this is possible. And what I found in my work as well is that kind of showing that things work, and then by creating a little bit of jealousy around being participating in that is the best way to actually broaden the scope and get people on board. So I wish you an absolutely great luck in developing anticipatory governance system in the region, and also a little bit of creativity of getting different countries on board and having a variable and diverse approach to that kind of anticipatory governance in the region.
Thank you very much, Berend. Some other thoughts from panelists? Otherwise, we can start wrapping things up. And I will hand over to Noima after some of the final thoughts have been shared. Donna or Pierre or Miriam?
It's just a quick thought from my side is we need to leverage the UNESCO chairs much better. We now have 2 in South Africa. We have, I'm sure the Professor Polly would support and expand that across and the work across the SADC region, and disseminate what is happening there across, and perhaps even have a number of bursaries for both politicians and youth to start participating in these. This is one of the ways that, linking back to what Professor Pauly said in the video, where we need to build the capacity to have futures literacy within everything that we are doing. So that's just one way of dealing with that. And then we need to look beyond our 5-year horizons, and we need to innovate our systems and processes. Again, as was referred to, we need to radically transform these so that we can deal with that. Globally, we've seen, as Professor Polyev said, that there are more and more ministers of the future. So the conversation in SADC should not be whether or not we have anticipatory governance. The conversation will be, will we allow those other ministers of the future to determine the future of SADC? Thank you.
Thank you. Donna?
I think right now this is an opportunity to really get present and to really think about what's happening and to be able to document what we're seeing in the system, all the fault lines, all the vulnerabilities, you know, especially if we're in a paradigm shift. You know, they say, Thomas Kuhn, right, you know, talks about the greatest paradigm shifts in science, says, you know, if you pay attention to the vulnerabilities and the anomalies in the current system, and here's a great opportunity, we're seeing them, you know, all come to the surface. It does provide an opportunity to go deeper into all of that, and that does perhaps start to foreshadow the shape of the new paradigm. And so I think for me, a big priority right now is really being aware, documenting, and trying to capture what's happening now and being able to take that knowledge moving forward, not forget about it, you know, but take the knowledge and lessons learned that are important and move that forward into the next conversation once the pandemic is under control and there's an opening for broader dialogue.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you, everyone, the panelists, the authors, and everybody involved. Noima, I hand over to you for your final words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dion. Thank you so much to I think, the incredibly rich conversation this afternoon. I mean, I have a couple of takeaways. There are many, but I wanted to just highlight a couple of things coming out of our conversations during the course of this afternoon, early evening. And the sense is basically that the region is facing numerous challenges that not only exposes the chasm emerging between government and society, but also the growing incapacity of governments to deal with old and new problems. This webinar made a strong case for anticipatory governance. But like both Barrett and Antoni pointed out, the challenge is that we are spending significant resources on early warning and foresight, but that there is a broken link between this work and concrete government action, specifically in translatable policy strategies and partnerships. There's also a challenge around the nature, culture, and structure of governance within a context of an absence of social peace, disconnected ivory tower governance structures, and equality in our region. So apart from looking at and working with regional champions, piloting certain projects, increasing research capacity, support for homegrown solutions, mapping the problems like Donna just pointed out now, and those sort of deep cleavages, and partnerships with donor partners, I really like the proposals around deep societal dialogues. And from a very practical perspective, the recommendation to integrate disaster risk governance and resilience approaches into current governance structures, I think that points to a potential way forward. Then the suggestion from Donna around a layered approach, so building capacity over various time horizons that address both immediate and beyond the horizon challenges that could support a transition from a legacy institution type approach towards an anticipatory governance approach is very useful. Finally, for me, it's really interesting that an anticipatory governance approach opens up the interlinkages between socio-ecological, socio-technological, and socio-technocratic systems. It challenges us to reframe our thinking, our learning culture, and actions completely. And this is very exciting, as it also creates an opportunity for drawing on our collective wisdom. Yet at the same time, we also know how difficult this is. And this raises the importance of finding windows and entry points for engagement. And most importantly, how do we arrive at a well-articulated vision? One of the questions that the panelists and the speakers did not answer that appeared in the question and answer box was, how do we ensure the youth and young adults are included in driving this conversation, as they will likely have to steward the future of governance? I think there's still a great deal to be done in this area. I'm going to leave it here and simply end by thanking all our speakers, our panelists and participants for their participation, and to point you to the work of our Futures program. Like we mentioned earlier and in the chat box, the papers are on our website, but you will also find interesting work that we've done on the implications of the wide-scale adoption of e-vehicles on the economic prospects of SADC, and the work that we are currently doing on the development of the green hydrogen economy in South Africa. Finally, once again, my sincere thanks to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, to Henning for their support of this webinar and our work. Good evening, everybody, and good afternoon. We hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks, Noima.
Thank you.
Thanks, Noima. Thanks a lot. Great event.